Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Inequality Watch. Just a quick note, this show is about an existential threat to humanity, the growing gulf between the rich and the rest of us. But why do we need a show solely about the topic of inequality? Because almost every other social ill which threatens the quality of our lives and the state of our democracy is affected by the underlying imperative of rampant inequality. Well, how do I know this? Well, just consider what happened this week in the catastrophic mess also known as Washington, D.C. Their well-heeled politicians and their lobbyist enablers found themselves at an impasse over much-needed aid for a country reeling from a worsening pandemic. The assembly of millionaires and their overpaid handlers found themselves at a loss over whether to provide a $300 weekly unemployment benefit for the long-term unemployed or a $600 check for every American as part of a short-term stimulus package, among other sticking points. The negotiations were billed as an epic battle between two parties over a monumental piece of legislation, a dramatic struggle between competing ideologies over the substantive details of a critical bill that would come to the aid of an ailing American public racked by unemployment due to a virus that continues to spread unabated. But here on The Real News, it's our job to point out exactly how flawed that mainstream media narrative really is. And in the case of the aforementioned story, we just could not ignore how the media elites missed the big picture that reveals how warped the politics of wealth and power have become. That's because at the very same time that well-paid politicians were hand-wringing over extended unemployment benefits and just how much they could lowball direct aid to working families and still pat themselves on the back for being generous, they were simultaneously passing a massive defense spending bill with, get this, a veto-proof majority. That's right. In a country where the political elites cannot defend the people from the ravages of a deadly disease and the resulting catastrophic economic downturn, they had no problem passing a $700 billion defense bill with a supermajority of both Republicans and Democrats. And to get more details on what happened, I'm joined by my reporting partner, Stephen Janis. Stephen, thank you for joining me.
Tay, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Stephen, while COVID aid for Americans have stalled, both chambers of Congress managed to pass the defense bill. But that vote was actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because both chambers, both Republicans and Democrats, were able to come together and pass a veto-proof majority on a $740 billion defense bill. And one of the things they were proud about is they've been able to do this for 59 consecutive years. So while they can't pass any other meaningful reforms to help the citizens of this country, they're certainly willing to help the military-industrial complex.
So what are the current sticking points in the COVID relief package? What is the holdup?
Well, of course, there's always a debate over the unemployment benefits that somehow will be a disincentive to work. You know, that giving people $300 a month, suddenly they all want to sit home and drink margaritas. And there's also the fact that local aid to local governments is very controversial. They don't want to provide local aid to local governments. And also another interesting sticking point is liability to businesses. That is preventing businesses from being sued due to COVID. So those things are the sticking points right now.
But now Congress has devised sort of an odd plan to pass relief that basically seems a little desperate and shows how difficult it is for them to move meaningful legislation that benefits people. Can you talk about it?
What's really amazing about this is how they're doing this, kind of putting a time bomb on the whole thing, because basically the government has yet to pass legislation to fund itself. So they want to attach this bill to the general funding plan, meaning that if you vote against it, you're not going to be able to fund government at all, and Congress doesn't get paid. So it's pretty interesting how they're saying, hey, if you want your paychecks and your vacation pay, you better give something out to the people. So that's their strategy, and that just shows what a failure collectively they are.
Now, as we always try to do on The Real News, we don't just report on what happened, but try to provide some context as to why. In other words, dig a little deeper to provide some sense of what is truly driving such a counterintuitive outcome in a country that purports to be a democracy for and by the people. And to do so, we first want to start with a discussion of a philosophy of public policy that in part drives much of what we see in the outcomes of these two competing bills, but whose role is perhaps overlooked. I'm talking about an idea called neoliberalism. That's right. The controversial concept that government policy should focus less on improving the lives of the people and instead bolster the bottom lines of corporations. It's a market-based approach to public policy that turns public largesse into a pool for private plunder, an often controversial idea that evolved from the ashes of the New Deal to tout ideas like public-private partnerships and market-based solutions as the key to solving complex social problems. Or, as the esteemed Dr. Cornel West described it,
And because we live now under a neoliberal regime that reinforces denial, they see a problem, they financialize, they privatize, they militarize. All three of those processes are forms of denial.
Now, of course, this is a simplified rendering of the philosophy that infiltrates every public policy with the imperative for profit. But the point is, it's also an idea that infiltrates the confounding processes we see in Washington in ways that are often ignored, but we feel compelled to identify. What do I mean? Well, consider the language that has defined this debate over COVID aid as it has unfolded over the past 4 months. It's a notable way of characterizing the problems faced by the American working class that is illustrative of just what we're talking about when we refer to neoliberalism as a driving force behind bad public policy. Remember that the political elites in Washington are always, in a sense, walking a fine line. They have to find ways to explain why, for example, they can't pass legislation that would prevent surprise medical bills, or a recent report from Senator Bernie Sanders that shows the employees of the largest corporations like Walmart and Amazon relied upon food stamps to get by, while the same firms continue to benefit from tax breaks and subsidies that somehow never benefit their workers. It's a dicey dilemma for politicians who continue to dole out tax breaks for billionaires while people go hungry. A difficult balancing act for the elite in a country that seems often unconcerned about its status as one of the greatest purveyors of wealth inequality in the world. And it's also a way of characterizing the debate over unemployment aid and eviction protections that has been completely unchallenged by the mainstream media. A mischaracterization of the working class that has a huge impact, but is hardly ever analyzed.
The second part of our plan deals directly with those who have lost income through no fault of their own.
Meeting the needs of America's working families who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own.
Right now. And that there's still Americans who are hurting because of the virus that came to us from China, no fault of their own. And
so do you hear what I'm talking about? The notion that people in need of aid are worthy because, and I quote, it's not their fault. That's an interesting choice of words. Let's parse this a little bit, bearing in mind our analysis of neoliberalism. It's our fault when, as I mentioned before, we're rushed in for emergency surgery and we don't ask our doctor if he or she is in the network, and we're subsequently slapped with an astronomical medical bill. It's our fault when we worked 60 hours a week at Walmart and aren't paid a living wage and therefore have to apply for food stamps. And it's our fault when Congress passes a massive 2017 tax break for millionaires, which drains the Treasury and threatens the solvency of critical social programs like food assistance or housing aid. And just as important to whose fault it is, the language also prescribes whose fault it isn't: the rich and powerful feeding from the public trough. It's not the fault of private equity bankers who fought tooth and nail against the surprise medical bill legislation so they could continue to reap egregious profits from vulnerable patients. And it's not the fault of the uber rich who pay an increasingly smaller share of taxes thanks to favorable legislation in Washington. And it's not the fault of the billionaires who own Walmart or Amazon's Jeff Bezos that their employees can't afford food. No, it's ours. We just couldn't cut it. We, the people, just didn't have the wherewithal to survive in a country where the top 1% control 40% of the wealth. Only when a devastating pandemic hits that hurts everyone, including the uber wealthy, does the populace become blameless. Of course, it's worth noting that the pandemic has paid off handsomely for the previously mentioned billionaire class. Economists estimate that the world's wealthiest gained an extra $500 billion in wealth since the pandemic hit. That's trillion with a T, but I digress. The point is that what neoliberalism aims to teach us is the same lesson that the noted French economist Thomas Piketty argued in his recent book, Capital and Ideology. As Piketty points out, wealth inequality is not an inevitable result of capitalism, creating more efficient markets and clear winners and losers. Instead, it's an ideology that creates the perception that the outcome is the fair result of a productive and useful system, a division of wealth and poverty that is not the consequence of some internal excellence, rather a byproduct of the constant drumbeat that the haves deserve it and the have-nots just don't. And it's through that ideology we encounter the language that has been used to frame the debate, the notion of fault, of blaming the working class for failure and rewarding the elites for success. of foisting unjust gains on people already immersed in abundance while debating the finer points of a $300 a week raise for the rest of us. It's also why, to return to our initial point, why defense bill passes with an easy super veto-proof majority while COVID aid languishes. Simply put, it's profit. I mean, remember, according to the policy model of neoliberalism, the military-industrial complex has to get paid first. Otherwise, the American enterprise known as market imperialism might find itself without enough overpriced weapon systems and overseas bases to continue the forward march of monetized gunboat diplomacy. The point is that all the unjust policies owe, in part, their success to the concept of neoliberalism, an idea that has inculcated the process of governing with the misleading notion that any public policy has to generate profit. It's a way of not creating a more equitable society through good legislation, but baking inequality into the core processes of governance. A shift in thinking that has created a for-profit mentality in institutions like Congress that have long abandoned the idea of making people's lives better. This is the point that the mainstream media misses when it refuses to challenge or even explore the origins of so-called no-fault capitalism, the lack of important context that allows the notion that people who actually fund the government through hard work and labor have to be practically blameless and angelically deserving to enact good public policy. The tendrils of for-profit governance that find form in language and philosophy that makes bad government good for business. My name is Taya Graham, and I'm your host of the Inequality Watch. Thanks for your time.